Welcome back. This is a summary of the textbook, Chapter 6. The last chapter that we looked at was Chapter 4. We will be leaving Chapter 5 to the side for now because Chapter 5 is a sideways step to different case studies, focuses on Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Germany. Chapter 6 is a continuation of the North American story, and more importantly, it kind of takes a step back. So the beginning of Chapter 6 is a bit of a review of some of the concepts from Chapter 4. So that's where we're going to get started. So Chapter 6 begins by looking at some of the complaints, some of the challenges that people were facing due to classic liberalism. Chapter 6 is entitled The Evolution of Modern Liberalism. So by the end of Chapter 6, you should understand the forces that inspired individuals to see a reform, an evolution of liberalism, and in that you'll see a new relationship for the government and the citizens. Classic liberalism, again, is freedom from government, and modern liberalism is an idea that we need freedom through government, that in order to live free lives, economically, to have a standard of living, quality of life that is equated with a good life, then there's a greater role for the government to play than what was assumed by classic liberals like Adam Smith. So the textbook begins by looking at the term robber baron once again. So the term robber baron is meant to be a derogatory word, that you have these capitalists who are new barons, new nobles, the nouveau riche, but they're robbing, right? What is their source of their wealth that they're collecting? They're robbing wealth from their workers. So because they are guilty of slashing wages, evicting their workers from their company houses, they're not going to negotiate with union leaders about trying to have safer working conditions. These capitalists are seen as the embodiment of what is still flawed with classic liberalism. And that is the nature of mankind, right? So government is going to need to regulate that, create legislation to protect workers, to make things like minimum wage or maximum hours. And in England, we started seeing the Factory Acts of the 19th century, but in Chapter 6, we're going to be beginning to look more at the American story and some of the attempts for progress there. So you may remember from Chapter 4 that not everybody thought that capitalism could be reformed. That in Chapter 4 we focused on individuals like Marx that said that capitalism had to be replaced. They envisioned, Marx did, that these robber barons wouldn't willingly give up their power, and therefore a violent revolution between the interests of the robber barons, the bourgeoisie, would have to fight the interests of the workers, the proletariat. But the focus of Chapter 6 is to see if reform can happen within the system. Rather than replacing this system, let's reform it. So Chapter 6 is focusing on, in the beginning, the progressive era. The idea that we can progress from classic to modern liberalism. And in this progressive era, there's the key individuals. And one of the key individuals that I talk about a lot is Upton Sinclair. Upton Sinclair is a muckraker, one word, muckraker. He's raking up the muck, right? He's raking up what's wrong in society. And he, in 1906, he's going to visit the meat packing plants of Chicago, and he's going to write a book called the Urban Jungle, or sorry, just the Jungle. And when he talks about the jungle, he's talking about the absence of logic and law within the meat packing industry. So he goes to these meat packing plants. Not only does he see workers being abused, but he also sees that the meat that is being sold in the free market as pork or as pig, well, pig is pork, sorry, pork, or as beef, it has an alarming amount of rat and rat feces and rope and other things that he decides that the consumers in a free market, they don't know that they don't know what they're actually eating, and he's saying someone has to regulate the safety of these products in a free market, and that someone is the government. That you can't allow the industry to regulate itself, because the meat packing plant, they can be more profitable if they don't devote some of their money towards cleanliness of the factory. They'll be more profitable if they don't need to separate the rat and the rat feces from the pork. So if you allow the industry to regulate itself, then in the interest of profit, they're going to ignore the health concerns. And at the marketplace, if consumers go there and they look at some sausage that includes rat and some sausage that doesn't, and they can't tell the difference, then consumers are in a free market at a disadvantage. So one of the main flaws of classic liberalism relates to the nature of mankind, right? A theme of ideologies is this nature of mankind. And the flaw within the nature of mankind is that we are greedy. And because we're greedy, we are going to maybe misrepresent things in the free market. So a free market isn't necessarily the best market. That for consumers, there needs to be some transparency and some protection as to what they're eating. So the transition from classic to modern liberalism is expressed through the need to regulate the conditions of this meat packing plant in Chicago in 1906. Another need for more government in the economy can be seen through President Theodore Roosevelt at the turn of the 20th century. And some of this he'd actually, some of his policies, Adam Smith would actually be okay with. So one of the main legacies of Teddy Roosevelt would be his antitrust laws. The idea that he saw monopolies, these powerful monopolies like Standard Oil in the United States, that you'd have one company that would own the vast majority of an entire industry. At one point, I believe Standard Oil had more than 90% of the global oil interests. And looking into that, he could see how the market's not free if one of the suppliers, one of the producers, one of the sellers has a monopoly or a near monopoly. So if Russ McBride's the only person in town that is selling gasoline, and there's no town within 500 miles of us, so you need to fill up before you leave town, then I can charge an inflated price for that gasoline because there's no competition. So competition is one of the values of individualism. When you take competition away from a market, you take freedom away from the market. So some of what Theodore Roosevelt is doing, Adam Smith would say, yeah, you know what, we're okay with that. We're okay with government doing that, because if Standard Oil has monopoly, then the market is no longer truly free, and a free market is what Adam Smith wanted. So typically Adam Smith didn't like government involvement in the economy, right? Laissez-faire, hands off. But there was some time when hands were able to be on, and hands or government hands to the economy, and ensuring the freedom of the market by getting rid of these monopolies would be something Smith would be okay with. He passed things like the Hepburn Act, and in doing so he attacked other monopolies, not just Standard Oil, but monopolies or preferential treatment that railway companies were providing for certain companies. So the textbook talks about some of that antitrust acts and monopolies and how monopolies were limiting the marketplace. The textbook also talks about some of the political and social problems in America at the turn of the 20th century, including the first Red Scare. And a Red Scare here is a fear of communism. And we'll see the second Red Scare following World War II with the McCarthy era later when we look at Chapter 7. But here in Chapter 6, they're talking about the first Red Scare, a xenophobia in America, fear of outsiders, a fear of Germans, a fear of communists, a fear of immigrants. And, this seems a little familiar. Living in recent times under the Trump administration, there's pressure to, make a wall with Mexico, make America great again, and maybe turn away refugees and immigrants. This was also very popular. These emotions were popular in America following World War I. They felt in America following World War I that the global political climate was so chaotic that they needed to insulate themselves from some of the race and national tensions that other countries were having. So we do have the rise of political conservatism in America of the post-World War I era, and in that there's the ideas of isolationism. And isolationism, American isolationism, you learned about in Social 20. This is one of the reasons why the League of Nations fails, because America decides to retreat from the global stage. Could America today reject globalization and return back to a Harding-like approach of isolation? We have seen a little bit of deglobalization in a COVID and a post-COVID-19 world, and the reality is that some countries are feeling that they do need to protect themselves from some of the dangers of being part of a global village. So the idea of isolationism and nativism and anti-immigrants and refugees and xenophobia, it is coming back again, inspired by our fear of infection from interconnecting with others. So Teddy Roosevelt had started progressivism, but by the 1920s under presidents like Coolidge, we see a return back to collective or to classic liberalism. So the shift wasn't complete, and therefore the shift back to classic liberalism will help inspire or help cause, the Great Depression. So how is the Great Depression caused? Because no one was watching. There was no SEC, there was no no agency regulating the stock market. There was no Security Exchange Commission. And because there's no Security Exchange Commission, and because banking wasn't being regulated, we had people speculating on the stock market. And through the speculation on the stock market, there was hyperinflation of stock value beyond what they're worth, similar to what we're seeing today with GameStop and other stocks like that. And this gambling on the stock market was not sustainable. So there was a crash in the 1920s, in 1929, on October 29th, 1929. And following that, you have basically a decade of economic depression because of the nature of mankind. Because mankind was irrational, because mankind was speculative. If this, then what, right? Because mankind's like this, what do we need? Well, the idea is we need government to regulate the nature of mankind. Government needed to have the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, regulate, how much stock could you buy on credit? Because buying on the margin, this idea of buying if you only had 10% down, only inflated the value of stock. The textbook does a great job, by the way, of kind of hinting about some success stories of capitalism. They look at Henry Ford, and Henry Ford you could see as a bit of a welfare capitalist, in the sense of he's a capitalist who believes that he can look after the welfare of his workers. He's a welfare capitalist in the sense that there's a sense of paternalism there, that he understands that he can act in the best interest of his workers, and that will act in the best interest of him. So under welfare capitalism, Ford will, without direction from the government, increase the minimum wage of his workers, and he will reduce their hours to a 40-hour work week. And in hindsight, many people have suggested that Ford's an American hero because he creates the American middle class, or he creates the 40-hour work week. No, he does it in his own best interest because his workers are his consumers. He needs people buying cars, and if he's not paying his workers enough, then he's not selling as many cars as he could. But he also noticed that if he wasn't paying his workers much, there's a high turnover. But if he would pay them more, then the workers would stay longer, and he wouldn't have to train them all the time. He wouldn't have to keep retraining new workers. So workers that have been with you for longer than 3 months, once they're there for 6 months, a year, 3 years, how do you get them to stay? You pay them more. What's the advantage there? They're more productive. Workers that have been trained longer are more productive, and therefore he's able to produce more cars. So by paying his workers more, he actually made more money. He made more money because now he has more consumers to sell cars to, but higher paid workers were more productive workers because they stayed with him longer and they didn't need to keep training new people. So we do have this idea of welfare capitalism, and a capitalist would say, well, this shows we don't need the government to respond to the flaws of capitalism. The capitalists can respond to the flaws of capitalism. Henry Ford responded to the flaws of capitalism. And America became great the first time because of the pioneering, the visionary, the capitalist magnates of people, heroes like Henry Ford. But there was some notable changing social values coming in the post-World War I era, and one of the notable things was income disparity, that the gap between the rich and poor was becoming more obvious, and even in light of what Henry Ford was doing for his workers, not all capitalists were doing that, and some of the people on the wrong side of America, right, the being poor, they were beginning to become restless, for sure. So back to the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, we're going to have an economist, John Maynard Keynes, and Keynes will inspire this idea of the government must provide freedom through government. And we talked about this a little bit in Chapter 4 about fiscal and monetary policy. And fiscal and monetary policy, two terms you need for multiple choice for sure, and terms that you may be able to apply to essays and A1s. Fiscal policy is tax and spend. So how does the government regulate and settle the economy? They can tax and spend. So in good times, you tax so you can slow the economy down, because anything that's growing hyperbolically is not sustainable. So we slow that growth rate down to something more sustainable by taxing it, and then we accumulate money that we can spend on the people in bad times. Tax and spend. Another way is monetary policy. So tax and spend is fiscal policy. Monetary policy is another way to regulate the business cycle, the volatile cycle, and the monetary policy is by manipulating the amount of money in circulation by changing interest rates. So if you want to encourage people to save because the economy is growing too rapidly, it's overheating, if you need to have people stop consuming and start saving, have high interest rates. Somebody might say, you know what, I'd love to buy a new car right now, but a loan on a car is 20% interest. So I'm going to end up paying, if I take 4 years to pay this loan off with compound interest, I'm going to pay more interest than the original principal using the rule of 72, right? So if you have an interest rate of 20%, people might say, there's no way I'm going to walk away from this purchase. Whereas if you want to encourage people to buy, have interest rates of 0 or 1 or 2%, then people are like, well, you know what? What's the risk here? The risk right now is that the interest rates are so low that it's a great time to buy. If interest rates are high, people say no to buying, but they might say yes to saving. I can get 20% by putting my money in a bank. My money will double in less than 4 years. I should put my money in the bank. But if you go to the bank and the bank is offering you 1% interest, it's going to take you 72 years for that money to double. You're going to be dead. So why put the money away? Why not just go spend it? So another way for the government to regulate the volatile, the business cycle, the boom bust cycle, in a boom time, you're trying to slow that boom down. What do? Raise interest rates. It'll discourage spending and encourage people to be more thrifty, right? If the economy's busting and you need to recreate demand, how do you recreate demand? You lower interest rates, so then there's a very little risk of buying and there's very little reward of saving. So the textbook goes into more detail about the stock market crash. I've got some good notes in my online lesson for you there. But things of note, that here in Canada we also had obviously a crash, and similar to the problems that the Americans had early on, we also had a government early on committed to capitalism, and because they're committed to capitalism, perhaps maybe the suffering was more severe than it needed to be. So we had a Prime Minister Bennett, and Bennett had some relief camps, but the workers at the relief camps weren't getting paid much, and they actually decided to protest, and they took their protest to Ottawa. It was called the On to Ottawa Trek, and they were stopped in Regina by the RCMP, and there's a riot, and there's some shooting and stuff like that. So there was a lot of suffering in Canada as well as the United States, and there was people in Canada trying to convince the government to change their relationship. Say, government, we need freedom through you. And even though you are our employer, you have these work camps, which is a step in the right direction. You understood that you need to create work. The food is gruel. We're not getting enough calories. The walls are paper thin, so our workers are cold at night, and you're paying us slave-like wages. We're not making enough to actually be able to get out of poverty. In America, the solution came from a president called FDR, and his solution, inspired by Keynes, is called the New Deal. And again, my notes on this are quite extensive. The textbook talks about some of these alphabet agencies, which will provide relief, recovery, and reform within the economy. We need to provide relief for those who are struggling right now, so that their struggling can be lessened, right? And then, how is the economy going to recover? What are we going to do to get this bust to stop and get us to start leveling off and maybe start creating employment and growing the economy again? And then ultimately, so it doesn't happen again, how can we reform the system? So FDR is going to try to provide relief, recovery, and reform, the 3 R's, through his New Deal by introducing government regulation. And we call these new bureaucratic regulation commissions and committees the alphabet agencies. You don't need to know all of them, but it's important to know some of them. So one of them that I've already talked about, one of the problems of why the stock market crashed was no one was watching. One of the reasons why the stock market crashed is no one was regulating the selfish, speculative, greedy nature of mankind. So the government creates the Security Exchange Commission, the SEC. This is an alphabet agency. There's so many of them, they're going to be known by their letters, SEC, right? Security Exchange Commission created in response to the problems in the stock market. We're also going to see a Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And why is this important? Well, people lost their trust with banks. You had 10,000 banks that went bankrupt after 1929. And because of that, there was a rush on the banks. Everybody wanted to take their savings out of the banks before the bank lost their savings. And when money is taken from the banks and people go and hoard it back in their homes, then that takes money out of circulation. The economy shrinks because there's no money in there to invest and grow the economy. The bank can't lend money out to would-be entrepreneurs. So how do we encourage people to not take their money out of the bank so that banks can lend the money out to entrepreneurs to grow the economy, to create jobs, to recover? Well, we're going to need to create a reform in the economy. And what is that reform? A Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We're changing what we're doing. We're stabilizing the banking system by insuring individual bank deposits. Simple as that. We're going to ensure your money's there. You don't need to go take it out. You can take it out if you want, but we ensure that it's there. The SEC, the FDIC, these are reforms to very specific problems that helped cause the Great Depression. We're also going to see other things, an Agricultural Adjustment Act. We're going to see a Work Progress Administration. These are trying to, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, reduce farm, crop, and livestock output. There's too much. There's a glut. There's too much stuff being sold. Why is wheat not worth much? Because you're selling too much wheat. So in order to respond to the problems on the farm, the government had to convince farmers to actually be selling less stuff. If you sold less, you'd be able to sell it for more because it would be worth more because your product would be more scarce, more valuable. So the government ended up paying farmers to produce less under the Agricultural Adjustment Act. We also had the Work Progress Administration, where the government paid people to paint and to recreate art. to clean up some of the older art, or maybe to assist in acting. The Work Progress Administration also led to some jobs to help teach some of the new immigrants languages like English so that they could be more functioning in the economy. Make a long story short, the New Deal, the alphabet agencies provided relief, recovery, reform. Here in Canada, eventually, the Liberal government will be elected in 1935. Bennett will lose the election, and Mackenzie King and the Liberals will be re-elected. He had been the Prime Minister before Bennett, and Mackenzie King is going to introduce his version of the New Deal, and some of the things he creates might sound a little familiar. He creates a National Film Board. Maybe you've heard of it. He creates a Central Housing and Mortgage Corporation, the CHMC. He creates the Bank of Canada that's going to regulate interest rates. He creates the Unemployment Insurance Act. It's been named Employment Insurance now because it sounds more positive, but it's the same idea. He creates the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC. He creates the Trans-Canada Airlines, which later becomes Air Canada. He ends up investing in public health care. He creates Social Security and old age security, and all of this stuff is a revolution, right? It's a revolution in the role of government in the economy, and it is modern liberalism. It's the idea of freedom through government. So that's the first half of chapter 6. Second half of chapter 6 is the kind of like, okay, so what happens after that? Does everything work out? Is it like sunshine and happiness forever? And the answer is obviously no. The textbook goes into, now we find ourselves at war. So because of war, because of World War II, then the economy has to become a war economy. But quickly, at the end of the war, it's like post-war, then do you allow capitalism, classic liberalism, or do you allow this modern liberalism to control the economy, right? To basically define the economy. Well, after World War II here in Canada, that's when the government creates universal health care, the Canada Pension Plan. We create the Canadian Radio and Television Commission, the CRTC, that you learned about in grade 10. So in Canada, modern economic liberalism keeps going after the war. So it's disrupted a little bit by World War II, and then we keep going, creating more what we could call here in Canada alphabet agencies. And things look great until the 1970s. And then in 1970s, we have an oil crisis and stagflation. An oil crisis was, and maybe you remember from grade 10 social studies, the OPEC crisis is caused when the oil exporting countries of the world that were in favor of trying to drive the Israeli Jews into the Mediterranean Ocean, tried to punish the Americans for helping Israel in the Yom Kippur War. They decided, we're going to sell less oil, and we're going to drive up the cost of oil, and it's going to hurt your economies. If we can't hurt America on the battlefield, we're going to hurt them in economics. And America is the biggest importer of oil in 1973. So if oil becomes more costly, that is going to, because oil is the lifeblood of the modern economy, you need it to build and transport nearly everything, it's going to hurt America. So we have stagflation, inflation, because oil prices go up, the cost of everything goes up, but stagflation, because oil prices go up, then the economy stagnates. So stagflation begins to inspire people to question the logic of Keynes, to question the logic of freedom through government. And we have this counter-revolution, this idea of we need to go back to classic liberalism. And this counter-revolution is inspired by some economists, and Milton Friedman is one of them. John Maynard Keynes was saying freedom through government, and Milton Friedman is saying, no, we need freedom from government again. So it is a return back to classic liberalism, and therefore a return back to individualism, right? We need self-interest, not collective interest. We need more competition, less cooperation. We need more economic freedom. If we can just get the government out of the marketplace, then the marketplace can respond to, those closest to the problems can respond to these issues. And Friedman and his colleague Hayek, they're going to inspire the British Prime Minister Thatcher. She will become Prime Minister in 1979 under the ideas in England, in Britain, in the United Kingdom, that they're going to be able to fix the economic stagnation there by forcing people to be self-reliant. She's got lots of great quotes like pennies don't fall from heaven, they have to be earned here first on earth. It's the idea that you can't expect a free lunch from your neighbors. And that's what modern liberalism had become, was this idea of you know what, the government will take care of me. Well, in order for the government to take care of you, they have to tax others, and it was beginning to create a culture of dependence. So these individuals like Hayek and Friedman and Thatcher and Reagan, they're trying to break the culture of dependence that they thought was a road to serfdom, because we were becoming slaves to the state. They wanted to re-inspire self-interest by rejecting Keynes's fiscal policy, his demand-side economics, and their solution was different. If the economy is struggling, then let's cut taxes to the rich. And when you cut taxes to the rich, then the rich will be able to regrow the economy by investing in it. And they called this supply-side economics. Under Keynes, you tried to fix the economy through creating more demand. Under Reagan, under Thatcher, they tried to fix it by creating more supply. How do we create more supply? Well, we're not going to give money to the capitalists to expand, but what we can do is just take less money from them. So the top 1% of income earners, they were being taxed around 70% under President Nixon. But 10 years later, under President Reagan, they're being taxed less than 30%. So when you cut taxes to the rich like that, you free up billions of dollars. And the theory is the rich will invest that money back into the economy, and the benefits will trickle down. Never do that again, right? The benefits will trickle down. So when the wealthy have billions of more money to invest in the economy, then maybe they create a second assembly line. Let's expand. So here in Wetaskiwin, we have some companies that are major employers for the people of Wetaskiwin. And if Manluck was taxed less, they might say, you know what, now we can expand. We can create another assembly line. We just created 250 jobs. And the benefits will trickle down. Because now that, Joey has a job at Manluck, he's making $80,000 a year. Now he can afford that haircut that Joey needs. Now the hairdresser has another customer, and she or he has more money. So the benefits trickle down and it multiplies, right? And the source of it isn't to the government hand money to the poor or the consumers, demand-side economics. The solution is, the poor, the consumers, they don't know best how to answer the three basic economic questions. Let's give the money to the wealthy. We're not actually going to give them. We're just going to take less money from them. And that's Reaganomics, that's Thatcherism, that's trickle-down economics, and that's the main story of the second half of Chapter 6. Chapter 6 also talks about Mexico and Sweden and some other countries. We'll come back to them if and when it's important. For now, that's the story of Chapter 6.